Hi folks, Professor Fowler here. Just wanted to take a few minutes to do an informal video to fill in maybe some blank spots in the Week 3 forum and my weekly wrap that I put in there today. One of the things that we need to consider when we discuss domestic terrorism is, what percentage of national effort and funding should there be for domestic terrorism, of course, or international terrorism? Personally, I think that today, international terrorism is a much bigger threat. That's my personal belief. There are those who disagree with that. I think part of the reason that they disagree with that is that some people consider terrorist acts, even lone wolf attacks that are coordinated or prompted by viewing the internet and YouTube videos and that kind of things from overseas, they consider if they happen here in the States they're domestic. I do not consider those sorts of actions to be domestic in nature. I think they're international in nature because the motivation behind them came from an international source. For example, 9/11 in my view is international, as is the Boston Marathon bombing. Now, the Oklahoma City bombing was definitely domestic in nature, as were the incidents that took place at Ruby Ridge and Waco. I'm not sure we could really call that domestic terrorism. I think it was viewed somewhat in that light at the time, but we also had to learn very hard lessons from those particular situations about how we should handle that sort of thing. But Oklahoma City was definitely domestic terrorism. And there was certainly a time in America where domestic terrorism took up most of the funding and emphasis that we had. There is also a question today of whether Muslim extremist terrorism is an existential threat to the West. And for those who may not know what that means right off the top of their head, so to speak, existential threats are those which could end your culture. Now, when we look at individual groups like Al-Qaeda or ISIS, ISIL, that sort of thing, no, I don't think those are existential threats to the West. They couldn't come here. In their current form, they couldn't, launch an attack on the West, come here and take over the West or take over the United States. That would not be something that they could do at this point. But if we look at Muslim extremist terrorism as a whole, we look at the inroads they've made in Europe, in the United States, south of our border, plus what's going on in Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, those places, then I would argue that they are an existential threat because the goal is to create a worldwide caliphate, including the United States and Europe, which means that our culture would be eliminated because the two are not compatible. So I would argue that yes, it is an existential threat. Some of the things that we've seen here in the United States are a lot of activities by Muslim extremist groups on American college campuses, particularly liberal campuses. One of the groups that comes immediately to mind is the Council on American Islamic Relations, or CAIR, which is a group that, if I recall correctly, is associated with the Muslim Brotherhood, and I believe now has been identified as a terrorist-related group, at least. That's active here in the United States. We've also seen, of course, in Europe, unrest there with the immigrant populations that they have from former colonies and that sort of thing. Really a lot of activity. And I think that's going to build unless something is done about it quite decisively. For example, in Switzerland, in a national referendum, they voted that they would not accept any new mosques being built there. Now, it might be very controversial here. It's really a matter of personal perception, I guess, or your personal beliefs. But the argument there was that inroads of Muslims into Switzerland were fundamentally changing their culture and who they were as a people. And so when the people voted there, they voted no new mosque building. That's one approach, whether you agree with it or not. I think, well, I really don't want to make any suppositions about how President-elect Trump will deal with immigration. I think he will take a harder stance on immigration than outgoing President Obama, because I think President Obama took a very, very liberal view on immigration in general. You know, for example, we have these cities that are in contravention of U.S. law, but they harbor illegal immigrants. Personally, I don't think that should be allowed. You know, if you have the law, it needs to be enforced or change the law. So those are some of the things that that we need to look at. There are some groups here in the United States that are quite dangerous, domestic groups. One of them that immediately comes to mind is the sovereign citizen movement. If you're not familiar with that, the sovereign citizen movement basically believes that the U.S. government holds no power over them at all. They're sovereign in their own person. Basically, I would say that's anarchy, but that's what they believe. Another thing that's an interesting and really troubling development lately, especially for me as a retired police officer, it seems like there's been quite a rise in the incidence of violence against police officers in the U.S. Now, I don't have the statistics with me to back that up, but that is my perception, which could be erroneous. I'm going to have to look at that in further detail and try to determine to my own satisfaction if that's actually the case or not, but it certainly would appear that way from what I see daily on the news. There's some talk, I will put it that way, that there may be some organizations behind that effort. And at this point, that's very, very well, there's just many, many questions about that, whether that's actually true or not. And I would not deign to say one way or the other at this point. But I do think it's a troubling thing. Other than that, I think that most of the things that we needed to cover this week, we covered in my weekly wrap and certainly in your all's forum postings. Thank you for those. And so if there's no further questions, I'm going to close here. If there are any further questions, certainly feel free to email me, reference this video, and shoot me a question. I'll be happy to discuss anything with you. Thank you very much and have a great day.